At precisely 11:51 at night, the screen of my phone lit up in the dark study. The text from my husband Julian was brief and clinically cruel. "We have agreed. You are no longer part of the family." I did not even have time to process the words before another notification appeared. Seconds later, my sister Maya had liked the message. She hearted it. A casual, effortless tap of her finger, sealing my betrayal with casual malice. I did not cry. I did not call Julian and beg for an explanation. I did not text Maya asking what I had done wrong to deserve such a sudden amputation from my own life. Emotional reactions are a currency I stopped dealing in the moment that little red heart appeared on my screen. Operating with absolute, chilling calm, I sat upright in my heritage home. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. It was an audit. At 12:03 in the morning, exactly 12 minutes after my marriage officially dissolved via text message, I opened my laptop. My hands hovered over the keyboard for only a fraction of a second before I began systematically freezing every shared asset. I logged into the joint banking portal and locked the primary accounts. I navigated to the family business credit lines, the ones Julian relied on to fund his polished corporate consultant lifestyle, and I revoked his authorization. With a few more methodical keystrokes, I canceled the massive monthly retainers I had been quietly funding for the renovations on a house Julian and Maya claimed they were fixing up to flip. The reality was that I was bankrolling a parallel life. The digital trails did not lie. I watched the confirmation screens pop up one by one, each successful cancellation feeling like a surgical strike. They had assumed I would break down, that I would be too paralyzed by grief to touch the logistics of our lives. They relied on my empathy to act as a buffer for their betrayal. But they forgot that I am a head librarian and a meticulous archivist. I organize information for a living. I categorize, I secure, and I preserve what is important. In this scenario, the only thing left to preserve was my own financial sovereignty. There was no hesitation as I severed the lifelines. Love had turned into a toxic subscription, and I was finally footing the bill for the last time. This was not revenge. It was simply an accounting correction. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, and listened to the profound silence of my home. I poured myself a glass of cold water and stood by the window, looking out over the sleepy streets of Pacific Grove. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret or a sense of mourning for the husband I thought I knew, but there was only a sharp, icy clarity. I was no longer a wife or a reliable sister. I was a creditor, and it was time to balance the books. For 8 years of marriage, I had been the designated reliable one. At 31 years old, my identity was entirely wrapped up in being the shock absorber for everyone else's mistakes. I thought back to the early days of our relationship. Julian's consultancy had faced imminent bankruptcy. Without a second thought, I had liquidated my own personal savings, the money I had carefully set aside for my future, to pay off his mounting commercial debts and keep his business afloat. I had been the silent investor in his success, covering his deficits while he smiled and played the brilliant strategist. And then there was Maya. My sister was a masterclass in weaponized vulnerability. For years, I had spent thousands of dollars covering her erratic financial emergencies. I paid her rent when she was mysteriously short, funded her children's private tutoring, and bought her groceries under the guilt-tripping banner of family solidarity. Julian had always praised my generosity. He called me the backbone of the family. It is terrifying how easily capable, intelligent women can miss the most glaring red flags. We fall into the over-functioning trap, convinced that if we just manage the details, keep the peace, and carry the emotional labor, we will be loved in return. Covert narcissists like Julian know exactly how to use this against us. They do not overpower you with aggression. Instead, they weaponize your own empathy. They turn your instinct to help into a tactical blindfold. I had assumed Julian and Maya were leaning on me because they needed me. I never realized my compassion was the very engine sustaining their secret betrayal. They had built an entire hidden reality, complete with children and shared domestic routines, using the foundation of my relentless hard work. I had sacrificed my savings, my peace of mind, and my trust, believing I was holding our family together. Instead, I had been financing my own replacement. Looking back at the ledger of my life, the signs were all there. The unexplained transfers between accounts, the late nights Julian spent helping Maya with her so-called crises, his arrogant demand that I be understanding whenever he chose her emergencies over my needs. Empathy without boundaries is not a virtue. It is a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. I had spent my entire adult life writing blank checks to people who were quietly bankrupting my soul. But the era of the silent investor was officially over. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the old financial statements I had archived. The numbers stared back at me, a stark record of my blind loyalty. $150,000 in siphoned renovation funds, $450,000 in hidden trust allocations. My kindness had been a meticulously engineered fraud, and I refused to fund it for another second. I expected panic when the funds stopped flowing. Instead, I was met with a masterclass in gaslighting. The next morning, as sunlight streamed into my sunroom, my phone began vibrating with a barrage of unrepentant entitlement. Julian did not apologize. He sent a furious email demanding an immediate cash transfer, claiming I was jeopardizing his business operations and acting like a petulant child. Maya took a different route. She flooded my phone with dismissive voice notes. Her tone was dripping with that familiar, fragile exasperation. She called me unstable. She said I was overreacting to a simple family restructuring and that I needed to seek psychological help. She played the perpetual victim flawlessly, externalizing the chaos she had created and demanding that I clean up the mess. And then came Helen, my mother-in-law. Bound by her brittle code of social standing, she took to social media to launch a passive-aggressive smear campaign. She posted carefully curated updates about loyalty and betrayal, implying to her country club circle that I had abandoned my wifely duties and left her son heartbroken. It was a spectacular display of collective delusion. They were not shocked by the depravity of what they had done. They were only shocked that I had stopped playing along. This is the sociological reality of the perpetual victim archetype. People like Maya survive by forcing everyone around them to manage their collateral damage. They externalize blame so efficiently that you end up apologizing for their mistakes. And people like Julian and Helen enable it, preferring a comfortable lie to an ugly truth. Watching their coordinated attack, any lingering trace of familial sympathy I might have harbored evaporated entirely. Their total lack of remorse was the final key unlocking my restraint. They thought they could break me with social shaming and arrogant demands. They assumed I would fold under the pressure of public opinion and resume my role as the compliant provider. But their arrogance was their fatal flaw. They had stripped away the last of my hesitation, greenlighting a counterstrike they could never anticipate. I listened to Maya's final voice note, a tearful, manipulative plea about how I was hurting her children. I did not respond. I simply saved the audio file to a secure digital folder labeled Evidence. Every insult, every threat, every passive-aggressive post was just another asset in my growing portfolio of retaliation. They wanted to paint me as the villain in their sunlit suburban drama. I was more than happy to oblige, but I was going to rewrite the entire script on my own terms. At 9 o'clock the following morning, I walked into the sleek, glass-walled office of Sloan, an old friend who had evolved into an elite family law attorney. The shift from emotional devastation to professional warfare requires the right commander, and Sloan was a mercenary in a tailored suit. I did not offer her tears or a dramatic recounting of a broken heart. I handed her a secure flash drive containing the digital breadcrumbs I had meticulously compiled overnight. Sloan plugged the drive into her computer and began to read. She reviewed the unauthorized withdrawals, the canceled renovation retainers, and the archived messages where Julian and Maya discussed keeping me in the dark. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the clicking of her mouse. When she finally looked up, her expression was completely devoid of pity. That was exactly what I needed. She did not offer me platitudes about healing or moving on. Instead, she outlined a strategy of absolute financial annihilation. Within the hour, she drew up a formal 30-day notice of debt acceleration. We drafted a ruthless application for an injunction to freeze any further movement on the shared estate property. We transitioned the conflict from a messy domestic dispute into a merciless, airtight legal battle. Julian had used his corporate polished charm to treat our marriage like a hostile takeover. Now, he was going to face an opponent who actually understood the law. Sloan methodically cataloged his financial exposure, noting every instance where marital funds had been diverted to subsidize his hidden life. The paperwork was crisp, brutal, and undeniably legal. As I signed my name on the bottom of the formal notices, I felt the last remnants of the reliable, over-functioning sister fade away. I was no longer the soft landing pad for my family's failures. I was a plaintiff, and my terms were non-negotiable. I left Sloan's mahogany desk and stepped out into the cool Pacific Grove air. The transition was complete. The emotional weeping and the late-night anxieties were entirely replaced by the cold machinery of justice. Julian and Maya thought they were playing a game of emotional manipulation. They had no idea they had just walked into a legal slaughterhouse, and I was the one holding the blade. The final, lethal discovery came 3 days later. I was sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing a preliminary audit of the estate trust, when Sloan called. Her usually composed voice held a sharp edge of urgency. She told me to sit down. I already was. She had subpoenaed the original documents for the historic family estate deed and my personal inheritance trust. When her forensic accountant cross-referenced the files with the bank's internal records, they found a devastating secondary layer of betrayal. The signatures did not match. Julian and Maya had not simply siphoned joint funds through clever accounting loopholes, they had committed outright, calculated forgery. Julian had falsified my signature and bribed a corrupt online notary to systematically strip me of my ancestral home, attempting to transfer the deed entirely into Maya's name. This was the criminal kill shot. It instantly transformed the case from a bitter civil restitution battle into an indictable felony. They were no longer just ungrateful relatives who had exploited my kindness. They were felons who had conspired to steal my heritage. I stared at the wall, the magnitude of their deceit washing over me. They had planned to leave me with absolutely nothing. No husband, no sister, no savings, and no home. The sheer depravity of it was breathtaking. But instead of breaking me, the revelation forged a spine of solid steel. The forgery removed any lingering moral ambiguity. There was no path to redemption for them, no possibility of a tearful reconciliation. This was not a family misunderstanding. It was a premeditated crime. Sloan informed me that she was legally obligated to notify the district attorney's office. I gave her the authorization without a single second of hesitation. Let the prosecutors handle the corporate consultant and the fragile sister. I wanted the fraud charges filed immediately. I hung up the phone and looked around the heritage home that had been in my family for 3 generations. The walls, the crown molding, the history. Julian had tried to steal all of it to build a nest for his infidelity. But he had underestimated the archivist. I had kept every original document, every piece of correspondence, every verified signature sample. His forgery was amateurish, arrogant, and easily dismantled. I spent the rest of the evening preparing the final phase of my retaliation. The civil suits were ready, the criminal indictments were pending, the financial trap had snapped shut. The meticulous, over-functioning wife was dead. In her place stood a woman armed with ironclad forensic evidence and an absolute lack of mercy. The climax did not happen in a courtroom or a crowded restaurant. It happened exactly where the betrayal began, at the doorstep of my ancestral home. It was late afternoon when the doorbell rang. I opened the heavy oak door to find Helen standing on the porch. She looked nothing like the proud, socially obsessed matriarch who had spent the week slandering me online. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled. Her hands were trembling so violently that her expensive rings rattled together. Her face was ashen, drained of all its usual arrogant color. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate realization. "Wait," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He didn't tell you?" I looked down at her with chilling detachment. Tell me what, Helen? She clutched her designer handbag like a shield. About the funds. Julian told us you knew about the trust transfers. He said you were dealing with the transition privately. He said the money for Maya's house was an early inheritance payout you had agreed to. The truth hung in the air between us, ugly and undeniable. Julian and Maya had not just lied to me. They had lied to their own mother to cover the source of their stolen wealth. Helen had been an unwitting pawn, defending a son who had made her complicit in a felony. I did not offer her a warm smile or a shoulder to cry on. I did not invite her inside for tea. Instead, I reached into the foyer console and picked up a thick manila envelope. I handed it to her. She took it with shaking fingers. "What is this?" she asked. "That is a copy of the pending fraud charges and the formal criminal referral we filed with the district attorney," I said, my voice steady and devoid of all emotion. "And tucked behind it is the formal notice to vacate for the property your son and my sister are currently occupying. The funds are frozen. The accounts are locked. The police will be contacting Julian by the end of the day." Helen stared at the documents, the reality of her family's complete financial and social ruin crashing down on her. "Please, Nora," she begged, tears spilling over her manicured cheeks. "We are losing everything. You cannot do this to your sister, to Julian." Think of the scandal. I looked at the woman who had publicly shamed me just days prior. "I already did," I said. "Goodbye, Helen." I stepped back, closed the heavy oak door, and threw the deadbolt. I did not wait to hear her reaction. I did not linger by the peephole to watch her break down on my porch. The power had completely flipped, and the silence in my hallway was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The legal fallout was swift, clinical, and absolute. Within weeks, Julian was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and forgery. His corporate consultancy firm dropped him overnight, terrified of the public relations disaster. Maya, stripped of her stolen funds and her enabler, found herself socially and financially ostracized. Her fragile victim routine failed spectacularly when the court unsealed the evidence of her complicity in the theft of my trust. They lost the house, they lost their reputations, and they lost their access to my life. I secured my ancestral estate, locked down my assets, and established complete financial sovereignty. I live alone now, in my peaceful Pacific Grove property. The walls are painted a crisp white. I am surrounded by towering stacks of books, and I have a dining table that no one lies across. It is deeply, profoundly quiet. I have come to realize that what people often misunderstand about betrayal is that the hardest part isn't the discovery of the lie. The hardest part is the agonizing process of unloving someone whose kindness was just a meticulously constructed mask. Most societal conditioning teaches us to preserve family bonds at all costs. We are constantly fed the narrative that forgiveness is a moral imperative, that we must be the bigger person, even when the other party holds a knife to our throat. But the uncomfortable, unvarnished truth is that cutting off toxic ties isn't a failure of character. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. When you stop acting as the emotional shock absorber for people who feed on your overfunctioning, the chaos doesn't follow you. It consumes them. You do not owe your sanity to people who weaponize your empathy. You do not owe your resources to family members who view your compassion as a weakness to be exploited. Peace is not found in a tidy apology or a forced reconciliation. Peace is eating toast at your own clean table, knowing that every hard truth in the room finally belongs to you. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it is the only way to set yourself free, but freedom often requires closing the door and throwing away the key. Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts on this story, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive into justice and human resilience.